Hello, Adult Sunday School Leader. There's a song that we sometimes sing at our church called Waymaker. And there's a phrase in that song that says, even when I don't see it, He's working. Now, that's easy to say after the fact, when we can look back and we can see how everything worked out. But when we're in the middle of that hardship, when we're in the middle of that job loss, the relationship issue, betrayal, backstabbing, whatever it is, it's difficult to see how any good can come from the situation. But as Romans 8:28 states, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. Now, of course, all things are not good, but God can use those hurtful things to bring about good. And as Rick Warren said, God never wastes a pain. But when that pain is inflicted by a close friend, a family member, it can lead to family conflict that never gets resolved. And we've been looking at some of the family conflict in the lives of the Old Testament patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And last week we looked at a family jealousy that was in the lives of Joseph and his brothers. Now this week we conclude the story and the unit that's called Negotiating Family Conflict. This is the last lesson in the unit. It's called Joseph and His Brothers, Family Reconciliation. The focal passage is out of Genesis 42 and 45. And the point of this lesson is forgiveness can lead to family healing and restoration. Well, let's give just a quick background here. Joseph had a riches, or at least a comfortable, riches to rags to riches to rags to riches story. He went from being a favored son with a special coat, we looked at that last week. He went from that to being a slave. Then he rose to be the manager of an Egyptian official's household, only to be falsely accused of trying to seduce the boss's wife. Then back to prison where he interpreted dreams and eventually interpreted Pharaoh's dream of 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. Joseph's interpreting this dream of Pharaoh's resulted in Joseph being promoted to second in command in Egypt, where our story for this week picks up. Now the famine wasn't just in Egypt, but was region-wide, even where Jacob and his family lived, up in Canaan. So that takes us to Genesis 42, verses 3 through 5. Now, the crux of this lesson is in the last set of verses, so we're going to spend just a brief time in those first two passages. So in this first passage, we see that Jacob's family was struggling because of the famine, so he sent his sons to Egypt, where they heard that there was grain. Now, Jacob kept Benjamin, his youngest son, at home because of the fear that he might lose him, like he believed that he lost Joseph. Now, Benjamin, he's the only remaining child of his beloved wife, Rachel. Now, Rachel died giving birth to Benjamin. Now, Rachel called this son initially, she called him Benoni, meaning child of my suffering. But Jacob renamed him to Benjamin, meaning son of my right hand, or favorite son. And there it is again, favoritism. Well, between verses 5 and 21, the 10 sons of Jacob traveled to Egypt to buy grain. They appeared before Joseph, who oversaw the distribution of grain there in Egypt, but they don't know that it's him. Now, Joseph, however, recognized the brothers and actually toyed with them a little bit. Pretending not to know Hebrew, he used an interpreter to accuse the brothers of coming to the land as spies. And after several days, and some of those in prison, Joseph made a deal with them. Return to your homeland, take back some grain with you, but bring back your younger brother whom you left behind. And I'm going to keep one of your brothers here in prison until you return. Well, that takes us to Genesis 42, verses 21 through 24. Now, can't you see the brothers huddling here? They're discussing their predicament, not knowing that the Egyptian official they're talking to could actually understand them. They're confessing that they were likely being repaid for what they did out of jealousy and hatred when they took their brother and threw him into the cistern. Of course, that being Joseph, who's standing there listening to him. And then Joseph learned in this exchange that his oldest brother Reuben, was responsible for actually saving his life. Well, our last set of scriptures is in Genesis 45, 3 chapters later. So you know there's a lot more to the story that we're skipping here. So I'd encourage you to read these chapters and fill in as much as you need to, just based on the overall biblical knowledge of your class members. Well, that takes us to Genesis 45. Okay, we're in 45, the first 5 verses, where Joseph revealed himself. Now, at this point, we're 2 years into the 7-year famine, declaring, "I am Joseph." That must have been a powerful moment for him. But what happened afterwards certainly could have gone differently. Joseph could have followed his introduction by asking, "How do you like my coat now? Have you ever been thrown into a cistern? Let me introduce you to that experience." Well, such statements may have been justified based on the way his brothers treated him years earlier. Joseph had the opportunity to repay his brothers for the horrible situations he encountered while being in prison in Egypt. And we really couldn't blame him for seeing himself as a victim, and we wouldn't blame him if he wanted some payback, but Joseph refused to be the victim. He refused to use any physical and emotional scars that he had received as reasons for revenge. Joseph instead saw his experiences as signs of God's working in his life. After revealing his identity, Joseph asked about his father, if he was still alive. What a moment for Joseph's brothers. In an instant, the weight of their guilt and lies over the years was exchanged for a heart-stopping realization that the next few moments might be their last. Joseph could have ended their lives simply by waving his hand. Instead, Joseph invited them to come closer. The brothers received an invitation to be restored into their relationship. They were given a second chance. The burden of their lives were removed, the relationship repaired, and forgiveness extended. Well, Joseph saw their anxiety in his brothers and said, "Don't be worried or angry with yourselves." Joseph gave his brothers permission to stand tall, he said. He said it was God, not his brothers, who had sent him to Egypt. God brought him a caravan at just the right time. God introduced Joseph to the baker and the cupbearer. God sent the dreams to Pharaoh and gave Joseph the ability to interpret and offered a plan of action for Joseph. God is at work in your life too, okay? Even in those difficult and trying circumstances. Consider that God may be using those difficult circumstances and difficult people, including family, to bring you to a better place and a closer walk with Him. Now, you've heard that phrase, forgive and forget, but unless you get a case of holy amnesia, I believe it's impossible to forget. So a question you might ask your class is, how can we forgive and let go of the past when we can't actually forget the wrong that was done to us? It's important to remember what forgiveness is and is not. Okay, so forgiveness is not saying what the offender did was okay, or that I, as the offended, condone it. Forgiveness does not mean that you have to endure abuse. Forgiveness is not ignoring the problem or denying the hurt. Forgiveness does not mean that there should be no punishment or discipline. So, what is forgiveness? It's the releasing someone from an obligation. We see this in the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our debts. In other words, release us from that obligation. And that's the concept of bankruptcy, isn't it? Debt forgiveness. Well, here's something I found interesting, that is the origin of the term clean slate. It began in English pubs where the barkeeper would keep up with bar tabs on a slate and chalk, and occasionally the bar owner would forgive the tabs and wipe the slate clean. So as an example here, I've got it's a bar tab, but I'm buying Coke and Dr. Pepper since I'm a good Baptist, and we just wipe that slate clean, and that's how God forgives us, isn't it? Is He wipes that slate completely clean. He just doesn't leave a little bit of stain there, does He? No, He wipes. Oops, I'm remarking. He wipes that slate completely clean. Yep, there's Jim, completely clean. So let's transition from the financial illustration of forgiveness to a more personal illustration that deals with feelings and emotions. So suppose someone in my church did something to hurt me. They said something negative about me, maybe even spread a rumor about me that wasn't true. So on a scale of 1 to 10 points, where 1 is they just accidentally bumped into me in the hall, and 10 is they murdered someone in my family, I'm going to rank what they did and said as a 3. So they damaged me 3 points. So they owe me 3 points. So I go and collect those 3 points by doing the same thing to them. And this initially makes me feel better, doesn't it? But I really want punitive damages as well. So I might say and do something that's worth 3.5 to 5 points. Now, that's the mindset of gang retribution, isn't it? You do something to me, I'm going to do it back and then some. However, if I forgive that person, then I've released them from that debt of 3 points. You see, forgiveness isn't cheap. It's costly. And it costs the offended, not the offender. It costs the pub owner to wipe the slate clean, and it costs you, the offended, to forgive. So, simply put, forgiveness is releasing a person from an obligation and bearing the cost of that debt, bearing the cost of that obligation on yourself, whatever that is. And as the point of this lesson states, forgiveness can lead to family healing and restoration. And that's something important to remember as we enter the holiday season and we're around family a little bit more than usual. And sometimes that family members, or maybe a member or two or several, that it may include those who have hurt you. So let's live up to what the Apostle Paul wrote in Ephesians 4:32. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as Christ in God forgave you. Remember the clean slate? Not holding the debt, not holding the grudge. As Christians, God has forgiven us. He bore the cost of our sin debt. So let's show how Jesus has changed us by emulating him. Let's forgive the offense, forget the foul, and flourish in our relationships. Let's not forsake the offender, focus on the fault, and fall in our reconciliation. How's that for some alliteration? Well, when we focus on the long term and not the short term situation, we can see, as Joseph did, a divine purpose in any suffering we endure. This allowed Joseph to forgive his brothers when he had the power to either make their lives miserable or even to end their lives. Well, next week we have a special focus lesson as we end this quarter's literature. We'll be looking at the God who rescues from Psalm 30. Thank you so much for watching. I do appreciate you. Don't forget to pray for and with your class.